Imagine a world where every conversation, every interaction is a battleground. Sounds exhausting, doesn't it? Welcome to a marriage dominated by ego. The ego, that part of your personality that you regard as self, can be a formidable contender in the arena of marital conflict. It's like an invisible third party, always ready to defend its territory, always on the lookout for perceived slights or injustices. And when the ego feels threatened, it's gloves off, no holds barred. Consider Jack and Jill, a seemingly happy couple, but beneath the surface, their marriage is a battleground. You see, Jack is a stickler for punctuality. He values it, equates it with respect. Jill, on the other hand, sees time as fluid, something not to be confined by strict boundaries. So when Jill is late for their dinner date, again, Jack's ego sees it as a direct affront. He feels disrespected, unvalued. And so they argue over something as trivial as a few minutes. But here's the kicker. Jill too has her ego. She sees Jack's insistence on punctuality as controlling, stifling. She feels unappreciated, unloved. She retaliates. What was a simple disagreement escalates into a full-blown argument, with both parties digging their heels in, unwilling to back down, unwilling to compromise. And that's just it. The ego hates to compromise. It sees it as a loss, a defeat. It would rather go down fighting than admit to being wrong. And so Jack and Jill, like many couples, are caught in a perpetual cycle of conflict. Their egos, not they, are running the show. So, as we can see, ego can turn even the most mundane discussions into a full-blown argument. But remember, it doesn't have to be this way. In a later scene, we'll explore ways to keep the ego in check, to ensure that it serves you and not the other way around. After all, marriage is about partnership, about harmony, and there's no room for a bruised ego in that. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the ego's role in conflict and how to navigate its treacherous waters. Now, let's dig deeper into the emotional implications of a bloated ego in a relationship. The ego, with its desire to be right, to be superior, can cast a long and lonely shadow over a partnership. It's like a wall, separating two people who once felt so close they could finish each other's sentences. Imagine a couple, let's call them Alex and Jordan. They've been married for 5 years, but over time their egos have grown and filled the spaces between them. They've stopped listening to each other. Alex is so caught up in his own thoughts, his own needs, that he doesn't notice when Jordan is upset. And Jordan, well, she's too busy trying to protect her own fragile ego that she stopped reaching out to Alex. They live in the same house, they share the same bed, but emotionally, they're miles apart. They've become strangers in their own marriage. It's a heartbreaking scenario, isn't it? But it's a common one when egos are allowed to run rampant. The ego, you see, has this knack for making us focus on ourselves. It's a defense mechanism, a way to protect us from perceived threats. But in doing so, it often isolates us from the very people we love. It creates a chasm, an emotional distance that's hard to bridge. And the worst part? This distance often goes unnoticed until it's too late. Alex and Jordan, they didn't realize what was happening until they were already adrift. They were too busy nursing their egos to notice the growing silence, the increasing space between them. It's a sad reality, but it doesn't have to be this way. Ego doesn't have to be the villain in your love story. With awareness and communication, with a willingness to put your relationship before your ego, you can prevent this emotional distance. Thus, when ego takes over, it can create a chasm between partners, making them feel like strangers in their own marriage. But remember, it's never too late to reach out, to bridge that gap, and to find your way back to each other. What happens when you let your ego dictate your actions? Resentment, that's what. In the realm of relationships, the ego can be a silent saboteur. It's a subtle, insidious force, often masquerading as self-protection or self-assertion. But when left unchecked, it can breed a most destructive emotion, resentment. Consider the case of a couple who've been together for several years. They share a home, a life, a history, but like all couples, they've had their share of disagreements. Over time, these disagreements, fueled by ego, have morphed into long-standing resentments. When ego takes the driver's seat, it's no longer about resolving disagreements. It becomes about winning, about proving oneself right. Every argument becomes a battleground, every disagreement a contest of wills. And when one partner wins, the other naturally loses. And no one likes to lose. This constant need to assert one's own rightness, to invalidate the other's perspective, creates a bitter cocktail of anger and resentment. It's a vicious cycle. The ego feeds on resentment, and resentment in turn fuels the ego. And resentment, my friends, is a slow poison. It seeps into every interaction, every conversation. It colors the way partners view each other, turning affection into annoyance, love into loathing. It's a silent killer, gnawing away at the very fabric of the relationship until it's threadbare and fragile. But here's the thing, resentment doesn't just spring up overnight. It's a product of countless instances of ego-driven actions and reactions. It's the result of repeated patterns of invalidation, of dismissing the other's feelings, of placing one's own ego above the well-being of the relationship. That's why it's crucial to check the ego, to recognize when it's taking over. It's important to remember that in a relationship, it's not about being right, it's about being kind. It's about understanding, empathy, and compromise. So unchecked ego not only creates conflict and distance, but it also invites resentment into the relationship. It's a threefold blow that can chip away at even the strongest of bonds. But by recognizing and curbing the ego, we can prevent resentment from taking root and nurture a relationship that's based on mutual respect, understanding, and love. Now that we've seen the damage ego can cause, let's explore how to combat it. The antidote to ego, as it turns out, isn't one single element, but rather a combination of humility, empathy, and prioritizing the relationship. Let's consider humility first. Humility is the ability to recognize and accept our own limitations and failings. It's about understanding that we're not always right and being open to learning from others, including our partner. Humility allows us to take a step back, put our ego aside, and listen to our partner's point of view. Next, we have empathy. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. It's about putting ourselves in our partner's shoes and seeing the world from their perspective. When we approach conflicts with empathy, we're less likely to let our ego take the wheel and more likely to find a resolution that respects both partners' feelings and needs. Finally, prioritizing the relationship over individual egos is key. This means choosing to value the health and happiness of the relationship over being right or winning an argument. It's about recognizing that the strength of the bond between you is more important than any single disagreement or conflict. Now let's look at a case study of a couple who successfully managed their egos and improved their relationship. John and Mary had been married for 10 years and found themselves constantly at odds. They realized that their egos were getting in the way and decided to make a change. They began practicing humility, empathy, and prioritizing their relationship. Over time, they noticed a significant improvement in their communication and overall relationship satisfaction. So what can we learn from John and Mary? Well, it's simple. When we let go of our ego, we create space for understanding, compassion, and connection. We open the door to a more harmonious and fulfilling relationship. Remember, the antidote to ego is humility, empathy, and prioritizing the relationship. Let's summarize what we've learned today about the ego's impact on marriage. Firstly, we've seen how the ego can spur constant conflict. Small disagreements can escalate quickly when both partners are unwilling to back down or compromise. The ego demands to be right, to be superior, and this can turn even the most mundane conversations into heated arguments. Next, we've discussed the emotional distance that a domineering ego can create. When one or both partners feel misunderstood or unappreciated, they may retreat into their own worlds, creating an invisible wall between them. This emotional gap can slowly erode the foundations of the relationship, making it difficult for love and understanding to thrive. We've also touched on how an unchecked ego can breed resentment. When grievances are left unaddressed, they pile up over time, poisoning the relationship from the inside. This bitterness can lead to detachment, and in some cases, the end of the relationship. But there's good news. We've also explored the antidote to ego: humility, empathy, and prioritizing the relationship above individual desires or needs. Humility allows us to admit when we're wrong and to apologize sincerely. Empathy helps us understand our partner's perspective, even if we don't agree with it. And when we prioritize the relationship, we're choosing love and harmony over being right or getting our way. In the end, it's important to remember that a relationship is about two people coming together, not two egos clashing. It's about understanding, compromise, and most importantly, love. So keep your ego in check, communicate effectively, and always put your relationship first. A strong marriage isn't about winning or losing, it's about loving and growing together. And that's something worth fighting for. Thanks for joining us today. Until next time, stay connected.
Growth. Whether you choose to visit our YouTube page for enlightening resources or join us in person at our welcoming space at 5237 West Diversey Avenue in Chicago, we are here for you. It's time to discover what you've been missing.